We are going to be covering several systems in this unit, and the system we're going to begin with is the respiratory system. So take a deep breath, and here we go. First of all, a few fun facts about the respiratory system. Did you know that every day you take between 17,000 and 29,000 breaths? So over an average lifetime, that means that you'll be breathing 500 million to 750 million breaths. From that very first breath at birth until the last breath we take, we usually aren't very conscious of the breathing process. The only time we really tend to notice our breathing is when we're having a hard time doing it. With every breath that you take, you're bringing 3 to 4 liters of air into your lungs. And this is important. The air that we bring into our lungs is going to serve many purposes and allow us to survive. So what exactly are we breathing in when we bring those 3 to 4 liters into our lungs? We're breathing in a mixture of gases, and in the air, the majority of the gas in the air is nitrogen at 78%, followed by oxygen at 21%. There's 1% argon, 0.04% carbon dioxide, and lesser amounts of other gases. Why do we need the oxygen that is in that mixture? All animal and plant cells need oxygen for survival. The cells in our body use that oxygen to obtain energy from the food in a very important process called cellular respiration. We'll talk a little bit about cellular respiration in grade 10, and we'll learn about it in much more detail as you progress with biology. What basically happens in cellular respiration, the glucose that we get from the breakdown of our food in our digestive system reacts with oxygen that we bring in through our respiratory system to release carbon dioxide waste and water. The most important part of cellular respiration is the production of energy that is released in the process. And that energy was originally stored in the bonds of the glucose molecule. We can look at equations for cellular respiration. The word equation is glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide plus water plus that very important energy. So again, the glucose we get from our diet, it's released from our digestive system and carried by our blood to all of the body's cells. The oxygen we're bringing into our body through the respiratory system, and again, the blood is delivering that oxygen to all of our cells. And then within the cells, within the mitochondria of the cells, cellular respiration is occurring. So glucose in the presence of that oxygen is being broken down, and as a result, carbon dioxide waste is released. We need to get rid of that carbon dioxide because if it gathers in our blood, it will react with the water to produce carbonic acid, and that will change the acid level in our blood and lower the pH, which can have devastating effects on the body. Water is also produced, which we need to survive. And the most important part of the process is that production of energy. And that energy, again, was originally stored in the bonds of that glucose molecule. If we look at that equation chemically, the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. We're going to combine that with 6 molecules of oxygen. And as a result, we're going to yield 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and the form of energy that we have from this process is called ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and you can think of it as the energy currency in our body. This is the energy that powers everything that our body does. So for every molecule of glucose that undergoes cellular respiration in our cells, 32 to 36 ATP are formed. Cells use that ATP to power growth, to power movement, to power the building of new molecules, to power cell division, and all the very important things that are going on inside your body. All of those require ATP. How do we supply the oxygen to our body cells? That's the process of gas exchange. If we were a simple organism like a jellyfish or a sponge, the oxygen in our environment would simply diffuse across our cell membrane. And remember, diffusion is that movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low. So that oxygen would move from where it's high outside the cell to where it's low inside, and it would simply cross the cell membrane. For more complex multicellular organisms like us, that simple diffusion process is not going to work. We're going to require a complete respiratory system to efficiently deliver that oxygen and remove the waste carbon dioxide that our cells are producing. In humans and other mammals, that gas exchange is going to occur in 2 places in the body, at our lungs and in our body cells. So mammalian respiratory systems work very effectively and very efficiently because of a few characteristics. The first being that there are very thin walls in these systems, and that allows for easy diffusion of gases across the membranes. They are also very moist, which also aids in that diffusion process. And when we get into the complex structures of the lung, there's a large surface area, which again increases the efficiency of that gas exchange. Also around the respiratory system, there's a rich blood supply that's going to very efficiently take that oxygen and transport it to the body cells, and it's going to release the carbon dioxide for us to exhale. So you should know some of the structures of the respiratory system. As we go through this, you should be able to label this kind of diagram on your own. So first of all, air is going to come into the respiratory system, and it comes in through two routes, the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. From here, it's going to pass through the back of the throat, and that's a region we call the pharynx. And then air is going to move down. As it moves down, it's going to pass a few structures before it gets to the trachea. The first structure is the epiglottis, and what that does is it protects our lungs from any food that we might be swallowing. The esophagus is right behind that trachea, and so sometimes when we're chewing, some of the food might tend to go down that trachea instead of down the esophagus. We want to prevent that from happening because we could choke if that happens. Also, we want to protect the lung tissue from any particles from food. So the epiglottis is a cartilage flap that will close down over the trachea and prevent any food from going down that pathway. The larynx is also in this area, and the larynx you might know better as your voice box. It contains your vocal cords and other tissue, so that larynx is in that region. And then we move the air down into the trachea. And you'll notice the trachea has this ring-like structure. That's a supportive structure. It's made of cartilage, and it makes sure that that trachea is kept open and kept rigid. We don't want the trachea to be flopping over because that would make it very difficult to transport air through to the lungs. So we want that trachea held upright, and those cartilage rings help that to happen. Once the air passes through the trachea, it's going to branch off, and the branching kind of looks like a tree. And what happens is the air goes into these larger branch points called the bronchi, and singularly be the left bronchus and the right bronchus. Notice on the diagram that the right side of the diagram is the left side of the body. You really have to imagine turning this diagram and superimposing it on your body to get the directions correct. So the left side of the diagram is the right side of the body, the right side of the diagram is the left side of the body. Those bronchi are going to branch even further into smaller branch points called the bronchiole. So as they get thinner and thinner, we call them bronchioles. Now sometimes if you're sick, you may have heard of bronchitis, and that's the inflammation of the bronchi, the left or right bronchus. And there's also a disorder called bronchiolitis, which would be inflammation of those bronchioles. And both of those make it difficult to breathe. You might have a lot of coughing going on and general discomfort in the respiratory system. So that branching leads us to the left and the right lung. You do have two lungs, one on each side of your body. And then there's this muscular structure at the bottom, and that diaphragm separates our chest cavity from our abdominal cavity. It's going to play a crucial role in inhaling and exhaling that we'll talk about later. What this diagram doesn't show are the sacs that are formed at the very end of the bronchioles, and that's going to be the important part of the lung and the respiratory system in terms of gas exchange. And that structure looks like this. So if we orient ourselves, there's the bronchiole coming down. Those are the very thin branch points, and they're going to end up on these grape-like clusters called alveoli, and the singular of that would be alveolus. And notice that that organization and that structure increases surface area, and that's going to be important for gas exchange at this part of the respiratory system. You'll also notice that this system is very rich in blood supply, so those network and that netting of vessels around the alveoli are the capillaries, very thin-walled, and that's where your gas exchange is going to be taking place, putting oxygen into the blood and taking carbon dioxide out. And these two vessels that are coming in, the pulmonary artery is coming from the heart. It's oxygen poor, and so it's going to the lungs to pick up some oxygen. It's colored blue. All blood is red, but that one's colored blue to show us that the oxygen levels are low as the blood is coming into the lung. Coming out is the pulmonary vein, so once it's gone through the gas exchange and picked up oxygen, Now that blood is oxygen rich, we call it oxygenated, and it's going to return to the heart for delivery to the rest of the body cells. So if we take a little closer look at gas exchange and how that process works, the orange would represent the alveolus. So remember that kind of grape-like cluster at the end of the bronchioles. And the blue structure is the capillaries, so that would be the blood supply. And they come in very close association, and remember those membranes are very thin. And what we're going to have is diffusion of carbon dioxide out of the blood into the alveoli. And remember, the alveoli is part of the respiratory system, so from here that carbon dioxide is going to be exhaled. We're going to breathe it out. And that CO2 just moves by diffusion. It's in high concentration in the blood, it's in lower concentration in the alveoli, so it's going to move from that region of high CO2 concentration to low. On the other hand, oxygen is going to be in high concentration inside the alveoli, lower concentration inside the blood at this point, so it's going to diffuse from that area of high concentration to the area of low concentration, and that blood is going to pick up a lot of oxygen, and that oxygen is going to be delivered to the rest of the body. So remember, the thin membranes allow easy diffusion. We have to get rid of that CO2 because it will be toxic if it builds up in our blood. It'll form that carbonic acid that is very dangerous to our pH levels and to all the reactions that are happening in our body. And then after oxygen is delivered to the capillaries, it's going to go back to the heart and it's going to be pumped to all the cells in the body so that those cells can use the oxygen to carry out cell respiration. So you should be familiar with the pathway of air. Remember, air is coming in through the nasal cavity and the oral cavity through your nose and your mouth. At this point, it's warmed and moistened before it goes through the rest of the respiratory system. In those regions, you have hairs and mucus that trap dust and other particles. We want to protect the respiratory surfaces as much as we can, so we want to avoid any foreign particles getting into the respiratory system. The air then is going to pass through the pharynx, that back of the throat, past the larynx, which is your voice box, down the trachea, and in the trachea you've got cilia, which are tiny hair-like projections that are kind of always moving and serve to trap any foreign material that might have made it through. It's also lined with mucus that can trap dust particles and other foreign material that might be getting in. And just a side note, if in smokers, those cilia, the movements are really slow. They're very sluggish, and they don't effectively trap the foreign material like a non-smoker's lungs, trachea would. From the trachea, that air is going to go into the bronchi, the right and left bronchus, and then it's going to branch further down into the many bronchioles before it ends at the alveoli. That's kind of the end point of the respiratory system, and again, that's where you're going to get gas exchange, oxygen into the blood, carbon dioxide into the alveoli to be breathed out. So that is the respiratory system. I hope you can remember the structures. I hope you can remember the pathway of air, and also remember the structures of those systems and how they facilitate gas exchange.